Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
We welcome Dr. Tharoor once again to the Idea Exchange. And with your permission, sir, we will open the floor for questions.
Sure.
So, Dr. Tharoor, the first question, obviously, since the Parliament is in session, it is meeting in quite extraordinary circumstances. How is the experience, and what are the challenges that you're facing as an MP?
Oh, I think all the MPs are facing a tremendous number of challenges. First, we have the very artificial atmosphere created by the fact that we are meeting for a limited number of hours with a limited agenda and with distances amongst us which we are simply not used to. That creates a certain artificiality of atmosphere. Secondly, the abolition of question hour, with which the day would normally begin, has been a serious irritation and setback, because that was the occasion when, in fact, the only real occasion where you could elicit unscripted responses from ministers. Essentially, these written replies, which they give us even now to our questions, are largely written by bureaucrats, and they're usually drafted in language that gives the minimal information possible and doesn't actually respond to the thrust of the question. Whereas in question hour, you could ask targeted follow-ups, especially if the initial answer is evasive. And very often it was a very good way of putting the government on the spot, highlighting the whole question of parliamentary accountability, which is the hallmark of the system that we have adopted in the constitution of the parliamentary system. So that has been a major setback. The third constraint, which is a little more surprising, is the unwillingness of the government so far to discuss very serious issues. The obvious example being the China conflict. As you know, in the Lok Sabha, the defense minister came and made a statement. The prime minister has not opened his mouth. In fact, he's hardly been visible the entire week in the Lok Sabha. And the defense minister took no questions. The speaker did not permit MPs to even seek clarifications. Now, in the Rajya Sabha, the rules explicitly provide for clarifications, but beyond a handful of those, no further discussion was permitted there either. So Parliament is certainly feeling the onus, because back in 1962, while the China war was raging, Atal Bihari Vajpayee had asked for a Parliament session, had got it, and the government was hauled over the coals while the war was actually going on. It's an extraordinary phenomenon, which did a lot of credit to Indian democracy. But sadly, in today's situation, we are finding that Indian democracy has actually become a stepchild of the government's unwillingness to confront these matters. So the unwillingness to take questions and the disinclination to discuss certain policy issues has been a major constraint. Now, it's only been 1 week. Today would be the 5th day. But I really hope that by the time we are done, we will have had a serious discussion on the management or mismanagement of COVID, which has not happened in the Lok Sabha. I hope we'll have a serious discussion on the economy, and in particular on the unemployment aspects of the economy, which to my mind are amongst the biggest issues that we are facing in the country. It is to my mind unconscionable that a democratic parliament would not discuss that. So I think there are these things that need to be done. I've not said the government has said they won't discuss it. All I've said is we've not really had a serious conversation about any of this so far. And it's very much my hope that we will be able to before the 18-day session is over.
You were talking about discussions in Parliament. We know that, from the BSA meeting, what happened that the government refused to take up any short duration discussions. And, basically what the government treasury benches have asked the opposition to take up the issues which you want to take up during any debate on any bills, that if you want to discuss about economic crisis, you take up, you can talk it during the discussion on like any financial bills. This is what, and also as an extension of Parliament, in Parliamentary Standing Committee also, we have seen, much controversial, exchange of words between or letters between you and, other members and also Speaker, where again, there was that some attempt to kind of curtail or put some restrictions on discussions. What do you have to say about it? Both if you're taking up both Parliament and also, the Standing Committee meetings.
Right. Well, I have to say that I think it's a disturbing evolution in our practice. And from my own experience, it started with the BJP's unprecedented and I would say extraordinary decision to take the External Affairs Committee chairmanship for itself. Quite apart from my own disappointment as being defenestrated from that committee after 5 years, there is the larger message that India had sought to send to the world, through which we were essentially saying that as far as India was concerned, our political differences stopped when it came to national security and national interest, that beyond the water's edge, as it were, we were all one country and we stood together. And that kind of message was very healthy when one met, for example, with officials of other countries visiting ministers and parliamentary committees, foreign affairs committees from other countries. The fact that an opposition MP chaired India's Foreign Affairs Committee actually reflected well on Indian democracy. I'm sorry to say that the government has obviously put more importance on controlling and limiting the discussion. And you know, the obvious issues when Doklam was going on, as chair, I convened and conducted a number of very serious and constructive discussions on Doklam, and we submitted a report on India-China relations, including Doklam, at the end of that year. Whereas with the China crisis going on right now, the present chairman apparently has told the External Affairs Committee that it cannot be discussed because it pertains to national security. Well, you may as well wind up the External Affairs Committee if you can't discuss national security, and the same would apply to the Defense Committee. So I find this attitude, to put it bluntly, rather perplexing. When it comes to the IT Committee, we are currently in a hiatus, so I don't know whether I will be chairman tomorrow, at least not officially. But I know that I've not been told officially what my fate is or that of the other members of the committee. But even the speaker has concurred that I was fully within my rights in indicating that since an agenda item relevant to the Facebook issue had already been adopted by the IT committee at the beginning of the parliamentary year. We were appointed in September, and that very month, 2019, we adopted the agenda unanimously. And in that unanimous adoption, we had adopted an item about misuse of social media, cybersecurity, all of these issues, which were completely square on Facebook. In fact, the agenda item had actually carried on from the previous committee, chaired by the BJP's Anurag Singh Thakur, who had summoned a number of social media companies, including Facebook and Twitter, under that very agenda item. So when I was asked point blank on social media, for me to respond that since we have such an agenda item, the committee will undoubtedly want to hear from Facebook, and then to send an invitation was entirely appropriate. And the objection of one particular member, rather obstreperously brandished on social media as a sort of threat to the chairman that I had exceeded my authority, was completely out of line. I might add that if I had actually done something out of line, the invitation could not have gone, because the invitations are issued in the name of the committee, but not by the chairman, by the secretariat, which is answerable to the Secretary General of the Lok Sabha, who is answerable to the Speaker. So if there had been any doubt that what I was doing was in any way inappropriate or out of order, the Speaker could have stopped the invitation going out. So the entire storm in the teapot, I'm a bit disappointed that the media reported it as a tu-tu, meh, one side versus another side, as if they were equal. I was doing my job as I had done previously as chairman for 6 years of 2 different committees. I was doing it completely within the rules and correctly. And to this day, as correspondents like you know very well, I do not leak from committees. I do not speak even off the record or on background beyond my mandate, which restricts me to just talking about what the issues were and who attended. Everything else has actually been done, has been leaked by the very people who are now creating issues for me in the committee. Now, this is by way of background, the thrust of the answer to your question is, I think this kind of politicization of committee work is extremely unfortunate. Whether it is for the ruling party to want to keep sensitive subjects under its control, as we saw with the External Affairs Committee, whether it is ruling party members attempting to curb the responsible actions of an experienced chairman in order to serve their political agenda, whatever it may be, this kind of politicization is what was sought to be avoided by instituting the committee system. You will all remember that when the question of televising Parliament came up under Somnath Chatterjee, an explicit decision was made not to televise committee meetings, not only to preserve confidentiality, which of course is very often honored in the breach by leaks by members, but also explicitly to prevent the kind of grandstanding for the cameras that politicians feel obliged to do when they know that what they say will be telecast. They wanted it to be a constructive, focused exercise, committee deliberations. And that was the logic behind keeping cameras and records, publicly available records, out of the committee deliberations. And I think that if the ruling party were to respect that spirit through which the committee system was devised and under which it is effectively operated, then I honestly feel that there would be no cause for complaint and no cause for controversy. A lot of these controversies could have been avoided.
This is Shantanu Chaudhary from Kolkata, sir. Good afternoon.
Hello, Shantanu.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you that your party has been very vocal about the migrants issue since the lockdown was imposed, and your party president has also said that they will take care of the travel tickets for the migrants. And recently, the government has said that they have no data about the migrant deaths. So I just wanted to know that what is your view on that, and is your party doing anything to collect those data and send it to the government so that they can have a different view on that?
Well, first of all, the migrant issue we raised from the very beginning, and we did so because of the astonishing short notice of the lockdown decision. It was massively apparent that one consequence of the lockdown decision would be the fact that the government did not leave people any time to actually make any sort of alternative arrangements, to be able to manage to figure out whether they should stay where they were, whether their employers could make arrangements for them, whether they had to rush back home, whatever. And this 3.5 or 4 hour lockdown, after which the highways, the interstate buses, the trains, and of course the planes as well were shut down, was an act of great irresponsibility, conducted out of the same fondness for shock and awe that gave us the disastrously ill-considered demonetization decision and the very botched and hasty rollout of a GST system, for which the entire infrastructure was unprepared. I mean, demonetization was a bad idea implemented badly. GST was a good idea implemented badly. And haste often makes for bad implementation. And that's what we saw in the migrant workers crisis. Second, we were moved by the humanitarian plight. Everybody was. In fact, many states tried to react and reassure migrant workers. I'm very proud of Kerala in this regard. I myself was asked to record messages in Hindi and Bangla to workers from those linguistic areas, urging them not to go back and assuring them that they would be provided for with shelter and food until such time as it was safe to go back. And Kerala sent those messages out to the various migrant worker camps and communities, and we had no exodus for several months. It was only after the lockdowns went on beyond 3-4 months that some then started wanting to go back. And by that time, as you know, some special trains had been brought in and so on. Thirdly, the Congress party offered to help by saying that, I'm sorry, somebody's interrupting, or is that a problem? You're not able to hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead, Dr. Tharoor.
Okay, now I heard a lady's voice seemed to be interrupting. What I was trying to say was that when the Congress party announced it would help the migrant workers, what we said was that the migrant workers who could not afford to pay the fees that the railways were asking for, the PCCs in each state that was run, that the Congress had a capacity or a presence to do so, would pay them. The railways then issued a statement saying that this was not necessary. And so I'm not quite sure how many in the end were out of pocket, but the Congress party will stay with the president's commitment on this. Now, on the final question you asked, Shantanu, about data collection, the Congress is severely limited. In states where we are in power, we can use state machinery to collect data, particularly of returning migrants, and in those cases where migrants have left those states. But where we are neither in power, nor is the state government particularly mindful to help, whether it's a BJP government or a regional party government, I don't honestly see how Congress can do it. And if we can't do it because we have no authority to collect that sort of data, then I'm not sure how our attempting to do it or saying we will offer data to the government makes any sense. This is a government that has boasted about digital India. This is a government whose intrusive entry into the lives of Indian citizens has been rightly commented upon by those who fear the onset of a surveillance state. More and more, we are being obliged to download apps that give the government all sorts of access to our information, our location, our address, and more. Some of our biometric details, all of that. And so with the government having this kind of data at its extensive disposal, what is the big problem in not being able to account for this? I find this somewhat puzzling and perhaps more an indication that the government is unwilling to confront reality. By the way, experts, data specialists and statisticians have said, Shantanu, that it should be roughly between 28 and 41 million migrant workers in India. I think that's an extrapolation from state-level data that some statisticians have put together, but it does not have any official blessing or sanctity that I'm aware of.
Hello, Dr. Tharoor.
Hello, Shubhajit.
Good to see you again after some time.
Yes.
I just wanted to, take you to the famous letter that you and some of your colleagues wrote, and Manoj scooped it for us here, who's also here on this call. Yes. Wanted to know from you, I mean, if you could tell us, share the backstory on how did you get on to writing this letter or get on to be a signatory to the letter? That is one. Number two, after the letter was released and it became public, your studied silence. You are one of the most articulate Congress leaders that we know of. I have interacted with you more than a dozen times over the years as the Minister of State in External Affairs, as well as later. You've never been shy of giving out statements. Now, why the studied silence? And lastly, you are a man who educates us with big words, and you're coming up with a book of words. If I were to ask you about one word that none of us in this Zoom call know about, that really captures the state of the Congress party, if you could educate us today, what is that word would be?
Limbo is what some people would probably say. I'm not saying it for the simple reason that I am indeed maintaining.
That's not a Tharoor word, We need a
yeah, why
word.
not?
Yeah.
Tharoor uses short words also, Shubhajit, I assure you. First of all, as I've conveyed earlier to Manoj, this is not an issue that I'm really planning to engage very much on right now. I think it's widely known that the letter was written very much in a spirit of strengthening the Indian National Congress, not dividing it. The thrust of the intention of all the MPs who signed it, and non-MPs as well, but very distinguished former chief ministers, ministers, and others who signed it, had always been to work for the revival of Indian National Congress and not to weaken it. So the elements we have in common with our critics in the Congress is that we all seek an effective Congress party to challenge what the BJP is doing to the country. And unfortunately, the way in which this entire exercise played out at the working committee and so on, I felt it would not be constructive to prolong a discussion because at that point, the entire intent and thrust of the effort had been either misunderstood or distorted into a way that was not going to help the objective, namely to create an effective Congress party to challenge the BJP in power. And so I thought that right now, exacerbating the issue through additional comments would serve no purpose. And therefore, I decided that the right thing to do was to stay silent. The president of the party has taken it upon herself at the working committee to find ways to move forward from this limbo. There has been talk, as you know, of an AICC session before too long, ideally in the first quarter of next year, perhaps even the beginning of next year. So I think all of us who are concerned about the party just want to see some constructive movement, and we will wait for that. And I feel that there is nothing to be gained. We know that the BJP has been thriving on using the media as a weapon of mass distraction. It has been having eyeballs shifting away from unemployment, from economic failure, from the China crisis, from the mismanagement of COVID, towards things like Sushant Singh Rajput and Kangana Ranaut's demolition job, whether by her or on her is a different matter. All of these things have been what the attention of television viewers and the general citizenry have been sought to be focused on. I didn't feel, as a committed Congress worker and MP, that I should contribute to distracting the media further away from the BJP's astonishing failings of this time by spending all my energy talking about my party. The time will come. And I have said to the, God knows, 50 or 60 journalists who have approached me in the course of this period that I, A, don't intend to speak now, B, no, I will not speak on background or on the record, and C, when the time comes, when I judge it appropriate and right, I will speak, and I will not speak behind anyone's back. I will speak openly as I've always done. But right now, to speak openly on this issue would be to play into the BJP's distraction agenda, and the BJP will not find me obliging them. That's essentially where we stand.
Dr. Tharoor, just one question to that, since you mentioned about the AICC session. If Rahul Gandhi contests for the post of president at the next AICC session, do you foresee an election? In the sense, do you foresee somebody actually challenging him?
I just don't want to comment this, Manoj. Anything I say in response to a question like that becomes news, and I have no desire to make news on this subject right now for the reason I've explained to all of you. In any case, all our concerns are for the future of the party, and whoever is able to make a contribution to be part of that future has to be embraced and welcome. And this party is the only viable alternative. Let's be honest. It's the only viable alternative to the misrule and misgovernance that the country is suffering now. So everything that I do, including in answering questions, has to be with a view to actually supporting the objective of strengthening this alternative. That's the spirit in which I signed that letter. Since you were the beneficiary of a leak, you know perfectly well that it was not I who leaked it, and it was not, I don't want to say beyond that. All I'm saying is that nonetheless, I stand with all the 23 signatories. I stand with the contents of the letter, but the objective and the intent which has been lost is to strengthen the party and not to distract from the government's poor performance. And I will not contribute at this time to that distraction. Let me leave it there.
Fair enough, Doctor.
Yeah, can I just ask one small thing? Were you active in drafting the letter?
No. There's been a lot of misinformation out in the media. That's the only reason I'm answering this. Because I've read some pieces which implied that I was the principal draftsman, which shows that these people don't have access to the software that compares writing styles, because there's not one phrase even in that letter by me. But as a signatory, I stand by its contents. I am not the draftsman of any part of the letter, but I stand by the contents of the letter that I was invited to sign.
Fair enough, Dr. Tharoor. Liz, please ask your question.
Yeah, Mr. Tharoor, you are an MP from Kerala, and Kerala is a state where, one of the very few states, I would say, that, Sirf Gandhis are really respected and revered, unlike many other states.
Sorry, who is respected?
I said Gandhis, Gandhi family.
Yes, very much.
Gandhi family.
Yeah. And you have taken a stand which at least, like you said, that you've been talking about reforms, and your intentions were obviously for the Congress party is good only, but it was actually projected as somebody who's standing against the Congress party. And that in the state there were a lot of statements from the KPCC and other leaders, and other leaders. We have witnessed that, and and also several issues. Like Manoj has mentioned in the beginning about the airport. You have expressed your view, which is actually in contradiction to what the party has taken officially. So how do you think that it is going to work in a state like Kerala?
Well, as far as the Gandhis are concerned, I consider I have very good relations with with the Gandhis, and I've certainly at no stage said a single word against any of them. And I might add that the letter is very clearly about issues and not about individuals, about processes, practices, institutional revival within the party. I see nothing in the letter. I agree that it's been projected by some, and I believe maliciously, as being directed against individual members of the Gandhi family. I find that absolutely unsustained by the text that I read and signed. So I don't know where this comes from. We are concerned very much with the party's future, and certainly this is not a debate over individuals. So I want to leave it there because for various reasons on the question of the letter and so on, I've really said everything I'm going to say. But on the question of the Kerala Pradesh Congress Committee, I think that, some of the remarks that have been made that have been critical of me over the years, and as you know, Liz, it's not just this recent issue. There have been a dozen episodes in the past where my willingness to speak my mind has not been welcomed by adherents of quote unquote the party line. I have a very simple perception on this within a democracy. I think within a democracy, an elected representative has first and foremost a duty to the people who have voted for him and put him there. And that has been my strong conviction. And I would argue that it's because I've acted on that conviction consistently that I've been able to be re-elected 3 times. Secondly, when I speak my mind, people respect me even when they disagree with me. I've had lots and lots of feedback, not just for the most recent round of comments, but in the earlier controversies that have arisen, where people have said, we respect you for taking your stand. For these reasons, we disagree with you. And that's gone very well. And finally, on the specific issue of an individual leader saying something negative about me, that leader has come and apologized, and I consider the issue closed. Sometimes I think people, I've seen this too often in the last dozen years of my involvement in politics, people are carried away when they see a camera in front of them, and they say things they don't really mean, or at least they tell you later they didn't really mean. And that has happened to me. I mean, not that I've said it, but that others have said things about me or in relation to me that later they have told me they regretted and withdrew. So I don't want to hold grudges on that. Yes, I think in a democratic party, some differences of opinion are inevitable. A party position should ideally be formulated by taking the views of all stakeholders into account. I happen to be the MP for Thiruvananthapuram, so I deplore the fact that the party adopted a stand on Thiruvananthapuram airport without consulting the MP for Thiruvananthapuram. It's not that difficult to find me, as all of you know. And I think that had they been of a mind to speak to me, I would have given them the very cogent arguments that I had already voiced on the record during the election campaign 1.5 years ago in Kerala and on television interviews at that time in Trivandrum as to why I supported this particular outcome and opposed the then stand taken by the state government, which to my surprise today, this communist government's stand has been endorsed by the local Congress party. Now, they may have their reasons. I have my reasons. I have been very careful not to say one word against the party. I have, even at the MPs meeting, I placed on record my objections very briefly and said that having seen that the sense of the other attendees is in one direction, I just want to say I don't subscribe to your conclusion. I stick to my stand, but I respect your right to have the stand you have, and I don't want to prolong the debate on this. Nonetheless, indeed, 1 or 2 people took it upon themselves on behalf of the state government to attack me, whereupon the UDF convener actually said, can't do this. The MP has a right to speak for his constituency, and for you in the state government to pretend that you have a better right than him to speak for Trivandrum is unjustified. And I think at that point, everyone shut up. Now, why did I speak for Trivandrum? If you're interested, I can give you the reasons why the Trivandrum airport privatization issue should now proceed on the way in which it has reached so far. But in one sentence, it is simply that lack of connectivity from Trivandrum airport has been the biggest obstacle that I've encountered in my decade-long efforts to attract more companies to my constituency, to bring jobs and ancillary benefits to my people. And I have succeeded with getting in Oracle with persuading Ernst & Young when they were pulling out to not just stay, but to expand. And I have failed with companies like Intel and Tech Mahindra, who have said that, listen, we're very interested in everything you say about working in Trivandrum, but as long as you have such poor connectivity, we can't come. And this has been, for me, a major reason why I have been agitating for professionalizing the airport in order to attract more airlines, more flights, more carriers, and develop more prospects for the development of my constituency. It's the same logic under which I welcomed people setting up malls or setting up restaurants or setting up hotels. The whole logic is make this an easy place for outsiders to come to, which, unlike, say, Kochi, Trivandrum had a reputation for not being. And I was trying to make it more cosmopolitan, more welcoming, more open. That is an objective that I believe the people, the voters of Trivandrum, have really supported me on and respect and enthusiastically vote for. Why would I abandon that position because my party, for whatever reasons, and they can explain their reasons best themselves, has taken a stand that I find unreasonable and not in the interest of Trivandrum? After all the prominent leaders of the KPCC are not from Trivandrum. I am. That gives me a right to speak for it.
In the past, you have made some statements which have been construed by others as being in praise of Mr. Modi. And your answer has been to make 2 points. One, that if you don't praise him when he needs to be praised, your criticism will also not be heard or will carry less credibility. The second point you've made is that the Congress needs to understand why the people voted for Mr. Modi. I want to ask you, draw you out more on that second point. Why do you think people have voted for Modi, not once, but now twice?
Well, I think that a number of factors have come in, and one of them is certainly a perception, to use the word that has been mentioned already today in a different context. The perception about Mr. Modi is that he's a selfless figure with no family to make money for, with no agenda but the nation's betterment, and with an all-consuming dedication to his work. All the anecdotes about the hours he works, his single-minded dedication, and so on and so forth. So that image has managed to appeal to a lot of people who are not ideologically terribly committed to BJP or even not terribly interested in politics, but who think of him as a good person. Secondly, they've also, I think, voted for him on different occasions because of circumstances at that time. Certainly, for example, we in the South seriously underestimated the impact of Pulwama and Balakot on the North Indian voters' sensibilities in 2019. Similarly, whereas in Kerala we all have indoor toilets in our villages, we fail to realize the impact of even building toilets without running water. As you may know, there was a study done around the time of the 2019 elections that established that 65% of the toilets built in northern India under the Modi government had no running water, and many were being used as storehouses and godowns, and people were still defecating in the fields. Now, what's interesting is we assumed that voters would say, well, this is just for appearances, it has made no practical difference to our lives, but instead people said, at least he's done something for us. Similarly with the gas cylinders, practically no one could afford a refill of those gas cylinders, but the fact that one gas cylinder was provided meant he's done something for us. This kind of perception management was also brilliantly executed by the BJP on their social media, on their messaging platforms, on television debates, on WhatsApp, all of these things. So there was a deeply entrenched set of positive feelings around these things. Now, we were giving an entirely justified response. The economic failures of Mr. Modi's government in the first term, the disaster of demonetization, already by then the setbacks in unemployment. At the time of the voting, we had the worst unemployment figures in India in 45 years. The slowing down of GDP growth hadn't yet become negative, but it was slowing down to 4-point change instead of the 9% odd that Manmohan Singh had left the government with. All of these things were very rational intellectual arguments, and I believe totally accurate. I don't think the Congress party and the opposition can in any way be criticized for failing to grasp the extent of this government's inadequacy and failure. And yet, the Indian voter chose to vote on the basis of their perception of Mr. Modi rather than in their own economic self-interest. And that is a very, very paradoxical issue, which no doubt psephologists will study for some time. Now, there may have also been negative feelings about the alternatives offered and so on. I'll leave it to others to make that comment. But the truth is that we found ourselves in a situation where the voters clearly did not go in for the anti-incumbency traditionally associated with Indian elections. In fact, Mr. Modi, as we all know, increased his percentage of vote and his seats in the Lok Sabha in 2019. And therefore, I had said in 2014 two things, and you're absolutely right. One is that I said we should respect the judgment of the voters and honor them by taking their judgment seriously and refuting it on their premises. And then secondly, that we should, of course, praise Mr. Modi when he deserves it in order for us to have, if you like, a threshold or a yardstick under which we can criticize him. If we praise him for saying Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, then we are better off showing that there has been neither Vikas nor has it been Sabka Saath. So this whole business of we start criticizing from day one, in my view, was not going to play well with the public. Now, I take no satisfaction in having been proved right because I understand the political logic of the Congress party stand and other opposition parties stand that we criticize, and the job of the opposition is to oppose. In fact, I've never forgotten, even though I wasn't in Indian politics at that time, the astonishing revelation in WikiLeaks that the BJP leadership told visiting American envoys that their opposition to the Indo-US nuclear deal was actually only because as an opposition party, they were felt obliged to oppose everything that the UPA government was doing, even though they were assuring Americans privately that they were in favor and they would support the deal if they came to power, which indeed they did when they came to power. Now, that kind of culture of opposition is part of the reality of Indian politics. And as a relative Johnny-come-lately with only 11 years in Indian politics, I have no business challenging that way of doing things. But it's not my way. That's the only thing.
But Mr. Tharoor, if I can press you a little more on this. You said that this is about perception management, but if voters are willing to overlook that they have toilets, but they don't have running water, if they are willing to overlook that they have a cylinder, but they can't get a refill, surely this is not just about the Congress not being able to understand the Modi phenomenon. It is also the Congress not understanding its own record and the effect of that record on the people. So is it that you have also erred, not just in misunderstanding Modi, but also in understanding yourself?
You know, I mean, again, you're asking the wrong person, Vandita, simply because I'm drawing, if you like, conclusions as an individual MP and as a Congress leader. The national strategy was decided by others, and their national perceptions and how to execute those perceptions in different states would undoubtedly vary. I fully accept, for example, that things that I can say to my voters in Trivandrum, or if I campaign elsewhere in Kerala, and which play well and which win us votes, may not be the same messages that my colleagues in Rajasthan or Bihar are able to say to voters there. So I think that I have to give credit to the, shall we say, to those who decide what messaging must be targeted to which voters where, and say that I cannot pretend that my analysis or my preferences would necessarily be valid for every leader in every state at every time. And at this stage, the Congress party has had 6 years to introspect. It has seen what has worked and what has not worked. It has also seen where we have gained. We've gained seats in Kerala, in Punjab, in Tamil Nadu. There are obvious lessons to be drawn from where we have done well and why we should be able to extrapolate lessons to other states and other opportunities. But to my mind, when we talked about institutional revival, it was about creating more forums within the party for such conversations.
Pranav, please ask your question.
Dr. Tharoor, good afternoon. I'd like to come back to the Trivandrum airport issue.
Sure, Pranav.
I take your point about, having connectivity to the city. But, you had said in a tweet on August 19 that, and I quote, "The people of Thiruvananthapuram want a first-class airport worthy of the city's history, status, and potential. In this context, a decision, however controversial, is preferable to the long delay that we have suffered." So, don't you share the concern that a company without any experience in running an airport could be problematic, especially when the state government, which has experience in successfully running airports, is offering to run that airport.
Pranav, let me give you the background. First of all, by the way, when I issued that tweet, it was already 1.5 years since the tender had come out for Trivandrum Airport. So the delay had been incredibly frustrating. And during that period of delay, by the way, we ended up with more airlines shutting down, even before COVID. Of course, with COVID, it's been a disaster in terms of flights to and from, but that's a different story. Now, when you look at the background of this issue, when the government, the central government, announced that they were planning and proposing to tender licensing of these airports, 6 airports by name, the state government could at that point have decided that they did not want Trivandrum Airport included in that exercise. And they could have found other means of making this airport work. Tamil Nadu famously took Chennai out of the reckoning and said, no, we want the Airports Authority of India to continue running Chennai Airport. Kerala chose not to do so. It chose instead to participate in the tender, not as the Kerala government per se, but as an SPV set up by the Kerala government, which the Kerala State Industrial Development Corporation was supposed to front. And the bizarre thing is the Kerala State Industrial Development Corporation has never run an airport either. Now, as you know, a number of companies bid. The Kerala government, as you rightly said, has been a major participant in the SPV for Cochin, the CIAL, the Cochin International Airport Limited. And they could, for example, have asked CIAL to come in and offer expertise. Instead, they went to a private consulting firm. Whatever it may be, they negotiated with the central government that if their bid was within 10% of the winning bid, they would have the right to match the winning bid and take the airport for their SPV. And the central government, in a remarkable show of flexibility, said yes. But they came in with a bid that was something like 19-point-something% lower than the winning bid, which happened to be by Mr. Adani. Now, the tender terms were publicly known. They did not require you to have prior airport experience, so the assumption was you would find somebody with airport operating experience to come in and do it with you. We already know that for the other airports, Mr. Adani has won. He has signed an operating contract with some European airport operator who's going to come in as his partner and do it. We also know, because there is no secret about this, that the Kerala government's formula was intended to be to hand over a decent chunk of the SPV to a favored capitalist whom they would deal with. It's not as if the government was going to run the airport. So the ideological objection also seemed to be, putting it bluntly, opaque. And on top of that, it was rendered in any case null and void by the Kerala government's decision to participate in the tender process. Finally, the tender process is concluded, a result comes out. You play a game according to rules that you had agreed with at the beginning. And then you say, because I lost the game, I don't like the rules anymore and I'm rejecting. Now, no responsible economy can run on this kind of basis. Many in the Congress party and generally on the left-hand side of the spectrum don't like the company that happened to win it. I'm completely agnostic on that. I can tell you that I would have taken the same stand on the Kerala government if instead of Mr. Adani, it had been Mr. Yusuf Ali or Mr. Ravi Pillai, or for that matter, GMR or GVK or any of these other companies that had actually posted the winning bid. But they didn't. It happened to be Mr. Adani. Why is Mr. Adani willing to spend this kind of money and come into Trivandrum? Very simple. He was the sole bidder to develop and operate a port in Trivandrum, which is something which, frankly, we in Trivandrum are grateful that he came in to do that. And he probably thinks that he will gain from having connectivity possibilities between running the airport and running the port. That's his business. He hasn't told me this, I'm just surmising. But it doesn't really matter. Why? It doesn't even really matter how much he bid. All that matters is that he won. And so the question that comes up is, are you now going to tell a winner that he cannot take away the trophy that he won fair and square without actually making a mockery of the entire process? In fact, I blamed the central government that they took so long. more than a year after they had actually announced the results of the tender, to execute it. And therefore, the problem here with these guys is to my mind, that a process, every foreign investor will tell you that a predictable environment, a predictable regulatory process, everyone playing by the rules, and finally, of course, when things go wrong, a fair judicial or arbitration process, that's what investors look for when they come in. And India cannot afford to have the kind of reputation it's getting for processes being overturned after they've been concluded, for people being asked to shall we say, move aside because somebody doesn't like their face and like somebody else's face better. One can't proceed that way. So I want to see a Kerala that attracts investment. I want to see a Trivandrum that attracts investment. And I want, therefore, the system to play by the rules that were announced, agreed, and implemented.
So I just want to take you to, a lot of questions that are revolving Facebook recently. So of course, there was that entire Anki Das controversy. A couple of days ago, there was another report which said that there was that Facebook, there was a former data scientist, Sophie Zhang, who wrote a memo which was then reported, which said that Facebook is ignoring governments or political entities that are looking to influence elections. One of those was that they took down a politically very empowered group of 1,000 networks strong that was looking to influence the Delhi elections, but took it down and never publicly told anyone. And then she goes on to describe it as saying that a lot of Facebook's motivations are, trying to counter public, trying to counter any public relations problems that they have, as opposed to, anything that actually causes civic harm. My question basically to you then is that, given that there is a growing intersection between the digital space, online, and politics, especially with COVID and everything else, if you were in government today, how would you approach this? Is there any way to regulate this? What are your thoughts on A, what is happening, and B, in an ideal way, in an ideal sense, how you would create structures to kind of regulate things like this?
So Dipankar, let me preface this by saying I'm not speaking in the capacity of the chairman of the IT committee, because that capacity technically expired on the 12th of September. And we are awaiting reappointment or new appointment or no appointment or disappointment, whatever the government decides and the speaker decides to do. But I would say that we would be very wary, if we were in government, of venturing down the slippery slope of regulation, simply because regulation brings with it the specter of government control that could be a serious infringement on the Article 19 protections of freedom of speech and expression in our country. At the same time, it is entirely right to point to the manifest inadequacies of self-regulation. Other democracies, including most visibly the United States, because their committee hearings are televised, have openly challenged Facebook on the inability or their unwillingness or even malfeasance in the way in which they have actually dealt with the legitimate complaints that have been voiced. You may have seen a few days ago some famous Americans boycotted Instagram, didn't post anything that day until Instagram decided to take some action against hate speech. Facebook has come under similar pressures. And I think that we are seeing Twitter already moving to the business of putting warnings on tweets that they consider to have been either distorted or involving fake news or having gone beyond their standards and policies. So I think the process that I would wish to embark upon, if I were in Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad's job as the minister responsible, would be to encourage these so-called social media intermediaries like Facebook not to shelter purely behind the term intermediary. They're not just like a postman who delivers the mail and has no responsibility for the contents of that mail, which is the innocent line that they pretend is a reflection of what they do. They are more like a publisher who has to stand by the content of what they have published. And therefore, just as if I write a book and I say abusive things about you, I and the publisher can be taken to court for defamation. By the same logic, Facebook should own some responsibility for the content they allow to remain on their platforms. Now, how do we strike a balance? I think that this is where we can require self-regulation, but through a consultative process that takes into account the concerns of stakeholders who are not only the government. And that's my final point, that we must create mechanisms where ordinary internet users, journalists, politicians, government officials, and others, including perhaps retired judges, could collectively constitute the stakeholders who would be officially empowered, perhaps by legislation, to work as an independent, neutral, non-government dominated body to engage with these platforms. And like many of the broadcasting standards authorities around the world, or Press Council in India and so on, be in a position to issue advisories, strictures, and even criticisms when necessary, but without the power at the end of the day to actually enforce laws against them. Because once you give some institution the power to regulate and to enforce, to take enforcement action, you are, I'm afraid, opening up the space to government control of freedom of expression.
You just said that the Congress was the only party that could actually put up the kind of pan-India opposition that is required to counter the BJP and all that it stands for. Yet there has always been a question mark about your own loyalty to the Congress. Bandita just mentioned your praise for Mr. Modi on occasion, and you explained it. Explain why you felt that is necessary. Still, even your book, Why I'm a Hindu, was seen, at least by one reviewer, Kanchai Leia Shepherd, if you recall, in the Hindu, as not the work of scholarship, not the work of a scholar or an autobiography, but the work of a politician who wants to keep a foot in both the Congress and the BJP. How do you view these perceptions of of you sort of trying to, you being a soft Hindutva person who's constantly trying to prepare for that eventuality that you may have to join the BJP? And,
I think, sorry.
And what does it do for your own standing within the Congress?
So let me stress, first of all, that I consider such criticisms to be completely ill-informed and, in fact, reflect the fact that people don't read. Because I have a nearly 4-decade paper trail, Nirupama. I have published 21 books, thousands of articles, countless interviews and appearances and speeches. And no one will notice any dilution in my fundamental, almost visceral commitment to a certain notion of India, of political conviction, and of personal faith, which precedes my joining the Congress. Yes, I was a critic of the Congress at one time. And nonetheless, I was a critic from the perspective of somebody who has remained a steadfast liberal, who has celebrated in both fiction and non-fiction the pluralism of India, who has throughout in everything I've done and said, believed totally in a practice of non-discrimination, of inclusiveness, who has treated people of other faiths in a spirit of acceptance and respect. And therefore, to make something of a closet Hindutvavadi out of me is preposterous, to put it very bluntly, because it's very clear that anyone who has read Why I'm a Hindu, and I read Mr. Elia's or Mr. Shepherd's review with disbelief, because he very clearly had not read it very carefully. The book was a very sustained argument against Hindutva, not pretending to be a scholar at all. And nowhere did I, the first page it says I'm not a scholar. It says that I'm talking about the Hinduism that I know, experienced growing up in India and believe in and practice. And that Hinduism, of course, buttressed by the words of far greater authorities like Swami Vivekananda, who's been a profound influence on me throughout my life, Mahatma Gandhi and other prominent Hindus who are quoted extensively, explaining these principles of Hinduism, I said is an answer to the argument that the Hindutva movement has made, that it's time to stand up for Hindu values and beliefs. And I said, they are the ones who are betraying Hindu values and beliefs, because the Hindu values and beliefs that the vast majority of Indian Hindus know are actually the values and beliefs that I describe in my book. So I would urge any of my critics on that argument to please read my book. On the question of soft Hindutva as political positioning, I am the one who has said, and it's been quoted half a dozen times, so anyone can Google it, that if you go for Hindutva light, like Coke Light and Pepsi Zero, you'll end up with Congress Zero. And my entire argument, which goes back to my study of American politics, when Harry Truman famously told the Democrats that if you offer voters a choice between the Republican Party and a pale version, a pale imitation of the Republican Party, they'll go for the real thing every time. And it's exactly the same logic I have consistently argued in India. I have been a sustained voice against soft Hindutva inside the Congress Party, wherever I've had an opportunity to be, and in public all the time, without exception. I challenge anyone to show anything I've said that can be construed as support for soft Hindutva. In fact, I have said that when Rahul Gandhi goes to a temple, he is actually advertising his respect for his faith, for his own faith and his own beliefs. He is not making a statement against anyone else. And certainly, he, and for that matter, I certainly in Trivandrum, go with equal respect to mosques and churches as I do to temples. Because I'm not only showing faith and reverence and respect, I'm also showing respect for those of my constituents for whom those places of worship are important to them. And for me, it's across all faiths. If tomorrow I'm invited to a very, very small minority faith, I've attended Pentecostal gatherings with 50 people in the room in my constituency, I do so out of respect for them and their beliefs. And that's something which I believe is basic to democratic politics and has nothing to do with soft Hindutva. Anybody who has read with any serious amount of effort my writings, and I can even make it easier for them by pointing to a volume called The Paradoxical Prime Minister that came out 3 months before the elections began in 2019, which has essentially rehashed all of these debates and arguments, and which actually lays out very clearly what I think about Mr. Modi, why I praise the things that I praise about him, including his own energy and his dynamism and so on, and I criticize the things I criticize about him across the board in excruciating detail. So I think it would be rather preposterous of me to even think of going to a party that I have criticized in such lavish detail and taken apart so comprehensively in so many recorded writings that can't be taken back.
So, in the last few years, there's an impression, I don't know how true it is, in terms of foreign policy, that our relations with most of our neighbors has deteriorated, or we've reached is not as good as it has been, at least in recent history. To what extent do you think that part of that problem is that foreign policy in strategic affairs has become part of the domestic political rhetoric? And what does that do? As a diplomat, does that take you to an impasse where negotiation becomes, say, with Nepal on the map, with Bangladesh, the rhetoric, although we have a favorable government there, but there is a certain impression that India has domestic politics and the rhetoric that we have here from the government and its supporters.
Only from the government, I assure you, Akash. Let me stress that I'm not pretending that everything was perfect in our relationships in the past with our neighbors. But let me start off with the premise, which was certainly the Manmohan Singh government's premise when I was part of it, that our relationships with our neighborhood are of vital national importance to our country. Number one, because we need a tranquil and calm neighborhood in our own self-interest. If you have conflict and hostility around you in your periphery, investors will be scared away. If you want economic growth to be your primary focus, as Manmohan Singh's was, you need a tranquil and amicable neighborhood to facilitate that, number one. And number two, because it's actually in the broader interest of the subcontinent, because the SAARC region at the moment is, according to the World Bank, the world's most unintegrated or the world's least integrated sub-region. And it's absolutely shameful that a part of the world that used to be very integrated culturally, civilizationally, socially, and therefore also economically through trade links and so on, is now the worst or the least integrated region in the world. So for all of these reasons, the policy I advocated, I was invited when I was Minister of State for External Affairs to deliver the Lal Bahadur Shastri Memorial Lecture, and I chose this as my theme. And I made a strong pitch for asymmetrical relations with our neighbors, arguing that India could afford to give more than it took. When we sit around the table with our SAARC neighbors, we occupy essentially, we account for 70% of the population and 80% of the GDP collectively of all of South Asia. So we can afford to give and we don't have to be demanding. that was by and large the approach and the attitude that animated UPA. And I might say not always fully successfully. We know the resentments that some countries had at different times, but on the whole, this was the animating principle. What has sadly happened with this present government is that pandering to domestic constituencies has unfortunately taken precedence over the sensitivities of our neighbors. We saw this with Nepal on the entire business of the Madhesis and the Plains people, many of whom have relationships and voting relations with neighboring districts of UP and northern India generally. And the BJP's policies on that successfully and rather thoroughly have alienated much of the Nepali political establishment. On Bangladesh, we have seen this business of the Home Minister talking about Bangladeshi migrants as termites and threatening to throw them all back. Obviously, this has got Bangladesh's backs up. And for 3 months, our High Commissioner could not get an appointment to see the President, even to explain what India's stand actually was. And this is a Bangladesh that has cooperated with us in vital matters like anti-terrorism cooperation and so on. Pakistan, the less said, the better. And undoubtedly, there's blame to go around on the Pakistani side. And finally, with China, we have this business of the domestically targeted statement saying that we will take back Aksai Chin, which undoubtedly has not gone over well in Beijing. And we've also now got the obverse with the Prime Minister saying that, again, for domestic consumption, that China has essentially not transgressed, whereas all the evidence and the statements of the Defense Minister and the Army suggest that China has transgressed the LAC. So this question of domestic politics above all is rather frustrating for those whose principal concern is India's international relations, its international cooperation, its diplomacy. I don't think that our government has done any favors to its diplomats with the way in which out of control rhetoric targeting domestic audiences has made the job of our diplomats so much harder than it should be.
I have 2 follow-up questions, one to Akash and one to Dipankar's. First, to Akash's question, how do you see the current standoff? Did we, our diplomatic corps, did we fail to read China's intentions over the years or in the recent past when it was flexing its muscles more? And I think we were too confident about our relationship with China. So did we fail to read its intentions? What is its objective that you can read right now? My second question, which is a follow-up to Dipankar's question regarding Facebook. Sir, how do you see, like you said, it could be incompetence, it could be incapability on Facebook's part, but do you also see any collusion on Facebook's part or on part of its staff along with the ruling dispensation at the moment?
Well, that second question is difficult for me to answer as a chairman and a potential future chairman of this committee, because any answer would appear to be prejudging a process of inquiry that is not concluded. So you'll forgive me for passing on that second question of collusion. It's obviously you asked it because many have suggested such a thing, but that is yet to be established in a process of discussion or inquiry that could then lead to a conclusive report by the committee. We can always return to it at a different time, but not in my, as I said, once and potential future position on that committee. On the larger question of Chinese intentions, I have increasingly come to the conclusion that our policy of sidestepping contentious issues like the border and frequent misunderstandings that led to patrols intersecting with each other on the disputed LAC and so on, while encouraging bilateral economic relations, creating a terrible level of economic dependency on China, $100 billion of trade almost, and of course, massively lopsided terms of trade. All of this, I think, has played into Chinese hands. So the PLA has used the seemingly benign situation to repeatedly undertake so-called minor military incursions, inflict small-scale military setbacks on India, take a few square miles or kilometers of territory along the LAC for local tactical purposes, and then declare peace. And mutual disengagements are duly announced. Both sides claim the crisis is over, but China establishes and fortifies its new deployment. It's done the same thing, as you know, in Doklam, the last big crisis we had with them. And these mini crises always end with the Chinese in a better position on the ground than before, because they're establishing a new normal on the LAC. If I were to look at the specific actions of the last few months, my impression seems to be that they have advanced their position along areas of the LSE that they covet. They seem to be eyeing our construction on our side as something that they want to be in a position to threaten when they want to. They have clearly established a fixed presence in areas well beyond China's own claim line. And they've even constructed concrete structures as well as lots of tents and built additional kilometers of roads and so on. It may well be that their objective is to extend Chinese troop presence to the intersection of the Galwan River and the Shyok River, which would essentially make the entire Galwan Valley off bounds to India. And it's confirmed by the statement that they said that the Galwan Valley has always been China's, which is absurd because they've actually never claimed it before. So all of these things, to me, worry me very, very greatly, and particularly in the context of the longer term strategy of China. You all know that Beijing keeps saying the border should be left to future generations to settle, that our generation can't do it. That was said from the 90s onwards. Now, an entire generation has gone by or has been born with the argument that future generations should settle it. But it's clear that they know full well that each passing year would increase China's relative economic, military, and geopolitical strength vis-a-vis India, while shifting the LAC gradually in its favor. So they consolidate the LAC where they want it, and when an eventual border settlement, when they're ready for an eventual border settlement, maybe 20 years from now, it'll have to take these new realities into account. And in the meantime, these new realities are being created. Border incidents occur to keep the Indians off balance. And we also, the Beijing people are demonstrating to the world that India is not capable of challenging China, let alone offering security to other nations. So it seems to me, if this is my construction of Beijing's approach, strategic approach, that what they have done is absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, an extremely clever and extremely hostile strategy that is designed to cut India down to size and put us in our place.
Lastly, Dr. Tharoor, you are known as a man of letters, a man of long words. What is the purpose of long words if no one listens to every argument, and every argument needs to be made and settled in a sentence?
I'm not sure that I'm that much a man of long words. I've used words, particularly once. This whole thing started with one particular tweet about an obnoxious so-called journalist whom I don't really respect as a journalist. And that tweet created some sort of spike of, God knows, 1 million searches for the word farrago on the Oxford English Dictionary site. And OED tweeted that why are so many Indians searching for this word? And suddenly this became stuck to. And thereafter I began to make a joke of it. It's not that I'm somebody who prides himself on being able to communicate with clarity. So I would not want to use words no one understands, because then no one will get what I'm saying. And I hope most of the time, and I hope, for example, we've spoken for an hour and 15 minutes today, that you've understood exactly what I was trying to convey and not convey in my choice of words and the words to omit as well. But when it comes to this big word thing, when you are trolled, as it were, constantly, and I've seen all the WhatsApp jokes about Shashi Tharoor's Christmas greetings and Shashi Tharoor saying most of them are quite unfunny and in fact are gobbledygook rather than good English. But just to reinforce the message that I use words no one understands, I decided to play along rather than just be offended. There is an entire troll mafia out there. I'm not telling you anything you all don't know. They've successfully caricatured poor Rahul Gandhi in a very negative way and very unfairly, because he's a smart, well-read, intellectually curious person, has been reduced on social media to a papu. I've been reduced to some sort of Casanova, and I've been reduced to a Casanova who uses long words. So when I published The Paradoxical Prime Minister, which I've already mentioned, I deliberately twisted this by issuing a tweet saying, and tweet is a short sentence, as you know, saying that this book is more than just a 500-page exercise in floxi nosi nihilipilification. And as I surmised, it got far more attention than a mere tweet announcing the arrival of a new book would have got, because lots of people looked up the word and it became a rage, and parents were teaching their little kids to say floxi nosi nihilipilification and God knows what else. But it became a sort of running joke thereafter. And then when a certain chief minister who had been elected in alliance with the Congress abandoned us and went to the BJP, I was able to build on this myth of words by just issuing a tweet saying, word of the day, snollygoster, definition, an unprincipled, unscrupulous politician, coined in the US in 1845, latest use today. Full stop. I didn't have to name him. I didn't have to name his state or the incident. The message came across when people saw the definition on the tweet. So it becomes essentially an extended joke. It becomes a way of playing along. And you may have seen this exchange I had with Chetan Bhagat a couple of days ago, exactly the same thing. I had issued a tweet praising a column of his in very simple language. He replied saying, "Oh, thank you, sir, but superb is not a word I associate with you. I want you to give me a longer word." So I deliberately gave him an entire tweet full of unnecessarily obscure words, which more or less said the same thing, that I praised the simplicity of his writing, and I did so in obscure words. And it was just a way of laughing at myself and at him in the process. I think some of these things you got to play along in social media. I think one of the reasons people follow me is that they don't only get political messaging and they don't only get a party line from me. They actually see a real human being with occasional jokes and all, or at least with tongue sometimes firmly in cheek.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor, for patiently answering all our questions and taking all our questions. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.